Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the 22nd Annual Family Cafe. I'm Jeremy Countryman, Program Director, here with Joe McCann, our Policy Manager. Thanks for joining us for our 2 o'clock session. This afternoon, we have a really interesting conversation set to go, all about voting and how you can make your voice heard through the electoral process here in Florida. Before we do that, Joe's got a couple of messages from our sponsors to share.
So I just wanted to say also, Able United, Florida's disability savings program, allows individuals with disabilities the opportunity to save without impacting public benefit programs. Enroll by June 30th using promo code FAMILY75, that's FAMILY 75, to receive a $75 contribution and an exclusive prize pack. Learn more at ableunited.com. We also want to thank our sponsors from Career Source, Disability Rights, and Sunshine Health. We sincerely appreciate all your support that allows this to happen. Thank you.
And speaking of disability rights, they just so happens that they are part of this panel we have discussing voting in this session that we're about to start now. So thanks to them for putting the focus on how people with disabilities can have their voices heard through the voting process. So with that, we have Deborah, Jason, and Tony on our panel. So at this point, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to Jason Haar. Take it away, Jason.
Thank you very much. Thank you for attending our presentation. Here. For those of you who can't see this slides due to visual impairment, we will be describing the slides. The first slide has the state of Florida in orange on the top left, and it has Family Cafe presentation written in the middle, and today's date underneath it with the Family Cafe logo on the bottom right. Next slide, please.
Not letting me forward the slide. There we go. Thank you.
On the next slide, you have the word speakers in the top, in the middle, and then you have 3 pictures. On the far left is a picture of myself, Jason J. Haar. I'm a self-advocate for Access to Vote Florida. And in the picture, I'm wearing a tie and a suit, but today I'm wearing a gray shirt and glasses, and there's no facial hair. Our next speaker is Mr. Tony DePalma. You want to introduce yourself, Tony?
Thanks, Jason. So I am the picture in the middle of this slide. It's a picture of me in a blue suit that I haven't seen in months. And underneath is my title. It says Tony DePalma, Director of Public Policy, Disability Rights, Florida. Today, I'm wearing a baseball cap for my favorite baseball team, the New York Mets. I also have a ridiculous mustache I started growing a couple months ago, which unfortunately is taking over my life at this point. And I'm wearing a red shirt. Our third speaker is Debbie Dietz, and so I'll throw it to Debbie now.
Hi, I'm Deborah Dietz. I'm the Executive Director of Disability Independence Group. On the screen, the picture of me is at Family Cafe a couple of years ago. I'm wearing a colorful shirt with a black sweater over it with my hair down. Today, my hair, you'll see, is much longer because I haven't been able to get a haircut. And I'm wearing a royal blue tank top, and I'm sitting in my office. So you'll see the background of our conference room. Thank you. We're having some trouble forwarding the slides, but we'll get there. For some reason, it's not. There we go.
Cool. Thanks, Debbie. So this is our third slide. At the top of the slide, it says Access the Vote Florida. And in parentheses, it says ATVFL. And so this is what we're here to talk to everyone about today. Access the Vote Florida, as we'll explain in a little bit more depth in a little bit, is a state level disability voting rights coalition. We've been together for a while, and we'll get a chance to tell you some of our backstory about how we got together. In the center of this slide is our logo, actually. And I'm excited to show it to everyone because this is a good example of sort of how we approach this coalition work together. So the logo itself in red, white, and then blue with the silhouette of the state of Florida in the middle says Access the Vote. On the side that's blue, it sort of points to an arrow. And the subtext underneath says Inclusive Elections for All. As much as this might seem like a logo that was real simple for us to arrive at, it was actually the work product of several months of deep discussion. We had different graphical ideas about the ways to depict disability, which again are the types of graphics that typically get utilized in these moments. The universal sign of accessibility, but for everyone in our group, the universal sign for accessibility, someone in a wheelchair, wasn't applicable to their own disability or, some of the things that are of importance in the disability discussion for them. So we settled on this logo and this tagline, and it's something that we're certainly very happy to be able to show the world and begin, using as a letterhead on occasion, which we'll also talk about in a second here. So slide, if you're able to, Debbie. Cool. All right, on this next slide, at the bottom right, there's a graphic. It says vote, again, in red, white, and blue. There's a star in the middle of the O. The title of this slide says The History of Disability Voting Rights. And the real three quick bullets right here, they say disability rights are human rights. Voting rights are human rights, and so therefore voting rights are disability rights. I think that's Matt's associative property in work right there. But the point here is that our country has a proud history of fighting for voting rights, of trying to grow the voting franchise, of trying to make sure that all citizens in the country who are able to vote do vote and know how to vote. The disability rights part of that civil rights franchising is certainly not always been front and center in the discussion. But it does need to be said that to the extent that disability rights are human rights and voting rights are human rights, and so therefore voting rights are disability rights, the disability rights crusade, the disability rights fight as a part of how we vote and how we make sure that these processes are accessible and available to every citizen in our country who wishes to vote, is something that, even though it lags a little behind at times, we're here to help people in the state understand that there's a way to get together and talk about these things and try to make sure that we can help the state do the right thing to make voting easy and a enjoyable exercise of your democratic right. So I'll go ahead and say slide right there, Debbie, if you're able to advance one more. Cool. And so there might be some folks listening in today who got a chance to listen to Debbie and I talk about all of this at last year's Family Cafe. It was a really fun discussion. We actually spent about half of the presentation reviewing what now is just this one slide. And these are all of the important disability voting rights that together, along with a whole bunch of other constitutional amendments and other, court precedents, sort of lay the landscape for why people with disabilities should and need to enjoy an equal, accessible experience when they go to vote. So let's see if I can crunch 30 minutes from last year's session into 1 minute here. At the bottom right-hand corner of this slide is a yellow image with a ballot box that's red, white, and blue. And into that ballot box is being dropped a ballot. And around it are little lightning bolts, which I think is a neat depiction of why, voting is so important. The title of this screen says Important Disability Voting Rights. The three that are listed are the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The second is Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. So the ADA, we all love talking about the ADA, as well as the third bullet, Help America Vote Act of 2002, or HAVA. So all of these laws together operate to provide voters with disabilities an accessible experience, whether that's in person or vote by mail, and also that the experience itself affords a private and independent opportunity to vote. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. So I'll go ahead and advance the slide here if we can, Debbie. I think this is my last slide that I'm going to go ahead and talk about in this stretch here. This is actually a really cool image, y'all. The title of this slide says Disability Voting Block, the disability vote, in quotes. And the image itself is, I like to think of it as like a pool of water. And so there's a droplet of water dropping into this pool. The droplet of water itself is the sign we were talking about earlier, the universal sign for accessibility. And from the middle of the water going out to the end are a ring. And it says families, friends, advocates, educators, professionals, providers, bureaucrats. And underneath the title, it says the ripple effect of the disability vote. And I think the point here, and maybe it's open for interpretation, art always is that it's the voters with disabilities themselves and the exercise of the right to vote by a person with a disability that naturally affects all of these other sort of supports and systems that exist to assist people with disabilities, and helps together carry across the notion that voting with the disability is important. It's maybe even more than important. And I think Debbie's going to get a chance to talk about that on the next slide. So I'll go ahead and say slide right there.
Thank you, Tony. Now I'm going to talk about the importance of voting. You'll notice the title of this screen is Importance of Voting, and we have 2 bullet points. Why should you vote and how voting has an impact? And then we have a picture in the bottom right of your screen. The picture is a gentleman wearing a white cowboy hat in a suit. He's wearing glasses, and it says vote if your life depends, as your life depends on it, because it does. The gentleman in this picture is Dustin Jart Jr. He's known as the father of the ADA. He was born in 1930 in Chicago, Illinois, and he contracted polio when he was 18 years old. And his grandfather is the founder of the Walgreens drug chain. And what happened is, as he was working towards getting the ADA passed, he drove around the country building support and was really instrumental in getting the law passed that we're now going to be celebrating the 30th anniversary of next month. So why should you vote? Voting is a fundamental right for you to choose who represents you. And you're hearing it in the news all the time over the last few days. Once you turn 18, it is your right as a citizen to vote. And your vote counts. You get one vote, the same vote as everybody else. It's not going to matter the color of your skin, your gender, your abilities. If you're rich or if you're poor, your one vote is equal to everybody else's. And they all count the same. So in 2020, which is now, we're estimating that there's 35 million eligible voters with disabilities. It's a huge number. And if you think back to the slide that Tony just did, that ripple effect of the disability vote, when you build that in with all of those circles together, the number increases to 62 million people. So imagine the power of 62 million votes. That will have an impact on everything, because you're going to use the power of your one vote in connection with everyone else to pick people that support issues that are important to you, that are going to create policy and develop projects that are important to you. So that is why your vote is important, and that is why you should vote. All right, let me see if I can get the slide to go. All right. the next slide, I'm going to switch it to Jay. Jay's going to take over and talk to us about ATV Florida.
Thank you, Debbie. So we talked a lot about voting and things up to this point, but now let's break down exactly what ATVFL is. On this slide, you have what is ATVFL, question mark. That's the acronym for Access the Votes. And then you have our logo. Right underneath that, and then the bottom right, you have the Rev Up logo, which is register, educate, vote, use your power. So, Access the Vote is a state chapter of the Rev Up campaign. Not all states have a chapter, but a majority of states do. The Rev Up project was started in 2016 as a way to galvanize the disability vote and educate people with disabilities as well as society as a whole. As Debbie said, it is a project of AAPD, the American Association of People with Disabilities. Justin Dart was president from in 1996. ATP is AAPD, is a national advocacy organization. We would like to take this time to acknowledge our partners and stakeholders in ATVFL. They include the National Council of the Blind, the Center for Independent Living, South Florida, Florida Sands, Florida Adapt, self-advocates throughout the state, Disability Rights Florida, Disability Independence Group, or DIG, and other civil rights organizations such as Legal Women Voters. Next slide, please. So now you have a slide that says history of ATVFL. And at the bottom right it says be seen, be heard, be counted, with three check boxes next to the words, and you have 3 bullet points. When we started in the summer of 2018 with the midterm election cycle. Why we started? We started because no one in the state had taken action as far as coming together as a collective, and we felt the time was right. It started with a series of emails between Debbie and Tony and myself, to determine whether a state chapter was even viable. And here's what we have done to date. In 2018, we created a series of questions, a 10-question questionnaire for 4 crucial races in Florida, which were the race for governor, United States Senate, and state attorney general. Although we did not get 100% response back, we did get a great amount of response. And the response we received were very thought out and very well crafted. Since 2018, we have continued our work and developed several committees, including voter engagement, candidate engagement, and state engagement, which Debbie will explain in more detail. Although we've done a great deal, there's still much more work to be done. And we hope that you will join us. Next slide, please. What we are currently doing is the first bullet point you see, and then you see ATFL now at the top. With an image at the bottom, red, white, and blue flag. The power of the disability vote on the bottom of the image. And then the second bullet point is our working groups that I mentioned. State engagement, voter engagement, candidate engagement. And the final bullet point is National Disability Voter Registration Week 2020 is July 13th through the 17th. So if you're not registered to vote yet, this would be a perfect time to get registered. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Debbie.
Cool. Thanks, Debbie. This slide that we just turned to, again, the title says Voting with a Disability During COVID-19, which is no doubt the elephant in the room that we should talk about right now. Like, how have things changed in the last couple months? What are the things that impact upon how people with disabilities, excuse me, vote? And how can we make sure that the state is aware of these things and trying to put appropriate mechanisms in place to ensure that people with disabilities can vote? The primary election is August 18th, I believe. The general election is November 3rd. So we have a little bit of time to make the right decisions. But one of the big reasons why our group is together is to talk about these issues, talk about how COVID has changed a whole bunch of this, and talk about how we're able to engage the state. So A slide ago, you heard you heard Jason talk about the fact that one of our working groups is the state engagement work group. Actually, a little bit more than a week ago, Access the Vote Florida sent a letter to the governor, to the Secretary of State, to the director of the Division of Elections, just introducing ourselves again and explaining some of our thoughts about what are the issues of importance at this moment that need to be on the state's radar due to COVID. Another of the groups you heard talked about, well, another aspect of state engagement is what we're intending to do after we've written to the state, which is write out to supervisors of election in all of the counties in Florida. So everywhere you are right now, we're going to be doing our best to reach out to your county supervisor, your supervisor of elections, and start a discussion with their office. Is there a need for training? Is there a need to train poll workers? Is there a need to help recruit poll workers with disabilities? Is there a need to do voter education? To the extent that we're able to preserve in-person voting, and it looks like August, there's a really good shot of that. In November, that's a big question mark. And so we're going to have to wait and learn at the same time that everyone else does. But, to the extent that we're preserving in-person voting, can we do, accessible equipment demonstrations? Can we have tele-town halls, sort of like what we're doing right here, but instead of Tony and Jason and Debbie talking, we have your supervisor and people in your community asking the questions of your elected officials. Is there a way to engage candidates on all of these matters, and not just so they can, go and research and give us an answer that, okay, that's an answer. Can we stress to candidates how these issues have changed due to COVID and why they're important in certain regards, especially due to COVID? The organization I work for, Disability Rights Florida, we're sort of looking at a range of issues that have just been turned upside down by the global pandemic. And as much as the image that I didn't describe on this slide, so if it's up on the screen, the image in the bottom corner is, I think, a bacteria ball. It's a gray image. The bacteria ball looks maybe light blue, and the scary hairs on the ball are red. But so as much as this is all scary stuff, right, this isn't meant to scare you. This is actually meant to empower you and show you how, even though there's all of these uncertainties, we're not sure what school looks like in August. We're not sure how people in jail and other incarcerated settings are doing right now. We're not sure how people in congregate settings are doing right now, people in nursing homes, ALF, group homes. So as much as COVID has affected all of these things, when we're talking about voting, although it certainly has affected it, there's so much room for advocacy, so much room to help the state do what's right here. So much of what already exists in those important laws I talked about earlier, as well as our state's own laws, kind of lay the map. And I'll explain right here. So the 4 bullets points on this slide are accessible in-person voting. So again, this is our eternal struggle. How is it that we can ensure that all the polling sites in the state, whether you're going to City Hall or a senior home or a church down the street, all of the different polling sites in the state are accessible in terms of parking, so having the right amount of accessible parking spaces, in terms of pathways, so making sure that there aren't any gravel lips or anything that could make it difficult for someone with mobility needs to move about, making sure that there's correct signage, making sure that all of the pathways inside of a building are accessible, making sure that the doors themselves either have a button that can be opened or they're opened already. All of these things are what we typically advocate for every single election. So this election's no different, right? To the extent that there is going to be in-person voting, we're going to want to make sure it's accessible. The state's been on notice for this for eons. The country's been on notice for this for eons. Despite that fact, all of the statistics, all of the government studies say that this voting in person, there are still a number of barriers that make that difficult. So hopefully in 2 years, we're not dealing with the pandemic anymore, and we can refocus the discussion on accessibility of in-person voting. But again, this year, we're trying to see how much of that in-person voting is capable of being preserved. And why should it be preserved? Here's why. Because voting by mail, as much as, if there's a pandemic and a state decides the only way people can vote safely is through the mail, and we don't know if that might or might not happen, but that mail balloting does not work for everyone. So that's actually my third slide. I'll jump to that. My third bullet point here, it says accessible vote by mail balloting. Voters with visual disabilities, for instance, when they receive a vote by mail ballot, unless that ballot is printed in a language they can read, like Braille, or has some other accessibility design built into it, that voter technically has to trust the person they live with, or a friend or a neighbor, to tell them what that ballot says and to make sure, like, hey, I'm filling out the circle I want to fill out, right? And earlier I was talking about how HAVA requires a private and independent voting experience. That certainly wouldn't be a private and independent experience, right? I know many voters with visual disabilities have family members and loved ones who help them through these moments. And no doubt that would work for a lot of people, but it wouldn't work for everyone, and it wouldn't ensure that the experience is private and independent. So as part of the letter we just sent to the state, we're asking the state to consider certifying a platform called Democracy Live, which is a ballot delivery and marking platform. What it does is it sends a ballot to a voter with accessibility needs, and the voter can use their own assistive technology to complete that ballot. And then from there, it's printed out and then put in an envelope, the same as any other vote by mail ballot. So there are solutions here. They're not all perfect, but the state has to begin considering some of this stuff. So now I'm going back to bullet point number 2, and then I'll jump over to bullet point number 4. Bullet point number 2 says curbside voting ? So here's a thought, y'all. Curbside voting is something that many states allow. Many states allow for voters who have a need to vote curbside, which would be, as a result of a physical disability or some other mobility impairment that would prevent them from easily going to cast a vote in person at an election, an accessible machine inside of a voting precinct. Many states allow for that technology, that equipment, to be brought out to the individual to vote in their car. Florida doesn't allow this. And it's been sort of a long-running discussion of whether Florida should or should not. But again, if one of our aims here is to preserve in-person voting, but there's all of these concerns relating to the pandemic that make in-person voting tricky or not fully safe in all regards, perhaps curbside voting is something the state could consider. I live in Tallahassee. We have a big civic center. There's a parking lot that probably could fit 700 cars in there. Is that something my county could set up and have people come, and almost like a drive-in movie theater? You park in a space, you hit a button on your app, I'm in space 492, and then, in a little while, someone with a machine comes out and you vote curbside. Right now, you're not able to do that in the state. Presumably, the state would be able to consider this without passing a new law, which means without having to bring the legislature back into session. But this is something the state should be really given a hard look at here. And the final bullet point on this slide that we've been on for a while now, thanks y'all, says signature mismatch ? So signature mismatch is also something that always impacts disability voting by mail. In Florida, when you submit your vote by mail ballot, you sign the outside of your envelope. And when you put that in the mail, you're like, okay, I've done my duty. I've registered my vote. But what actually happens from there? What actually happens from there is that that ballot goes to your supervisor's office, and they compare your signature with the signature that's on file. So there's a lot of reason people's signature change over time, right? When I was 17, my signature was basically just cursive, but I believed I was going to be the shortstop for the Mets, and by the age 20, my signature looked like Ron Killebrew or something. It didn't look the same anymore. So, that's of course one reason signatures change is people grow up. People change how they wrote their signature when they were 17. However, signatures change over time due to a lot of disability issues themselves. People who have loss of use of their limbs, people who have other dexterity issues that are, impacted by disability itself, people who might have a disabling injury that doesn't allow them to use their arms anymore at all. And so years ago, that was actually a really tricky problem because the state hadn't created a notice and cure provision for when that happens, for when your signature didn't match. Now there is a notice and cure provision. If you deliver a ballot that the signature doesn't look like it matches, the county within reason has an obligation to let you know, like, hey, we don't believe this matches. And then there's like an affirmation process that goes on from there, where you fill out an affidavit and you go down and update your signature. But that has to all be information that, because there's perhaps an increased emphasis on vote by mail balloting, we need the state and the counties to understand how signature mismatch functions for disability voting populations, and try to proactively push that information to help people know, like, hey, if you have to vote by mail, these are things to be on the lookout for. If you maybe update your signature, maybe look to be on the lookout for a notice saying your signature was rejected for one reason or another. So I'll stop there. That's just a real quick or lengthy sort of rundown of all of these issues that are impacted by COVID specifically. And hopefully there's some questions about some of what we're just talked about here, but I'll go ahead and say advanced slide here. Debbie, thank you.
Now comes the fun part. How do you get involved? How do you become part of what we started? So let me describe this slide to you first, and then we'll start talking. The title of the slide is Join ATVFL, which stands for Access the Vote Florida. And in the bottom right, you're going to see a picture. It's a rectangle. The top of the rectangle is like an orange sunset. The bottom is dark. And then you see there's a silhouette of different types of people, all shapes, sizes, and abilities, holding hands together. And then we have 4 main bullet points. The first is join our mailing list. The second is join one of our working groups. The third is join our monthly stakeholder meetings. And the fourth is join our communications team. So let's start with join our mailing list. You can email us at accessthevoteflorida, atvfl@disabilityrights.org. And why would you want to do this? Because this is how you're going to get the information. We send out weekly emails. In these emails, we're going to put all the minutes from our meetings. So even if you can't attend the meetings, you can read or listen to what happened at the meetings. Any important documents we'll be putting in these emails. And we're going to link you to important information that's related to voting and people with disabilities. And if you want to be more involved and one of these areas specifically interests you, join one of our working groups. Right now, there's 3 of them, like Jay told you. The first is state engagement. And in this group, we're looking at what is the state doing to prepare for elections. We wrote a letter to the governor, like Tony and Jay told you, telling him what he needs to be aware of and what issues are important to people with disabilities in the state of Florida. We're going to be working directly with the supervisors of elections, and we want to work with poll workers and poll worker training to make sure that the people actually on the ground the day of the election know what they're doing. The next working group is voter engagement. We want to work with the voters. Spread the word. Let them know how important their vote is. Teach them how to register to vote, and educate and train them on the issues that are important to persons with disabilities. And then our third group is called candidate engagement. And this is where we're going to do candidate questionnaires again, like Jay told you we did for the last election. We want to look at all the topics that are important to persons with disabilities. This is going to include healthcare, education, transportation, housing, and the list goes on. And if you have an issue that you care about, come to our meetings and tell us so that we can add it to the list of what we're working on. We're going to engage with candidates at the federal level. We have our presidential election. We're also going to engage with candidates at the state level. We're going to look at all the House and Senate seats that are up for re-election. And when there's contested races, we want to know what those candidates feel about disability issues. And then you're going to have so much information, you'll be able to take it at the local level to your local elections and make sure that those local candidates know the issues and are educated. We also want to do teletown halls like Tony was talking about. So if you want to be involved in that or submit questions or ask that it be in your community, let us know. Join this working group. We also are going to have monthly stakeholder meetings. So the way we set it up is every Friday at 11 a.m., we're going to have a meeting and we'll rotate each of the working groups and then a stakeholder meeting. And you can join. It's all by telephone. It's free. It doesn't cost you any money. If you need an accommodation, just call Tony and he'll make sure that you get the accommodation you need. And if you really just care about getting the message out and you love social media, join our communications team. We're having our first meeting tomorrow to start. So you can come in at the ground level and be involved. We want to utilize every resource available to us to get these words out and this message out. So join our communications team. All right, let me see if I can get the slide to actually move. All right, so now the next thing, as Jay was talking about AAPD, that's our national organization that we're the state chapter of. They're doing a 2-day summit. It's called POWER, the Disability Vote, Disability and Election Summit. They were supposed to do this back in January, and it was going to be to see all the people running for president and listen to them and hear what they were talking about. But because of what happened in the world, they had to postpone this event, and then they rescheduled it for June, and it was going to be in person, but then they decided to turn it into a virtual event. So now it's going to be 2 half days in June. It's going to be June 22nd and June 23rd. It's free for you to attend. You can register online. We'll be putting all the information in our newsletter and our emails that go out. And come and listen. You're going to hear about the power of the disability vote, that ripple effect that Tony started to talk about. We're going to look across America what people are doing about disability, about elections, what they're going to do about COVID-19, the impact of it, and look at all the factors that are going to impact this election this year. It's very important. Also, just as Tony wanted me to tell you, I'm going to be one of the speakers. I'm going to be on a panel that is going to talk about how to make a state chapter and how powerful that would be. And I'd love you to join and hear more like what we're talking about today. And it's an opportunity for you to learn not only about what's going on in your own area of the country, but what's going on throughout the country. All right, let's see. So now this slide, we're going to open it up to questions. And on this slide, you have little circle bubbles and clip art with white question marks in them. And I believe the Family Cafe people are collecting the questions, and you can type in your questions and the three of us will try to answer them for you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. As you mentioned, we are taking questions. So if you do have a question, go ahead. If you're watching the video on Facebook, you can put it there in the comment thread, and the questions will come to us, and we'll read them out so everybody can hear them. We do have a couple that have come in already. So Joe has one. Why don't you go ahead, Joe?
Yeah, and thank you guys very much for that. That was so thorough, and you did such a great job of explaining potential questions. Now we just got a few so far, but I'm sure we'll have some more as they come in. But Tony, you mentioned the Braille option for voting by mail. We were curious, does that happen anywhere? Just tell us a little bit about that, and what's the tech, just tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, Joe. Actually, this is a really interesting point. So there is Braille balloting in other states. Some of the court battles of recent years about accessible vote by mail balloting resulted in some states, rather than allowing for electronic ballot delivery and completion, rather than make it an electronic process, just intended to make a ballot with Braille. When COVID happened and we, in our chapter, our coalition, began having these conversations, it was one of the first things I mentioned to some of our partners with visual disabilities, like, hey, does Braille balloting work? Is this what we should be pushing the state to do? And apparently, some Braille, if it's printed on paper stock that's pulpy or isn't quality stock, the Braille itself can become depressed and kind of smudged or smeared in different regards. So the partners that we got a chance to have this discussion with, which again is like a beautiful part of our coalition, right? Like not just, hey, what Tony thinks or hey, what Debbie thinks, you know, sort of like having a broad enough table to ask voters with different disabilities, like, hey, how does this work for you? And is this a solution? And, oh, it's not for this reason. Well, what is? You know, this was when we, and you know, talking to our coalition partners with visual disabilities, began learning about the platform Democracy Live, how the state seems to be on the brink or cusp of certifying the platform, making it available to the counties. And from there, again, unless the state has a plan, it just hasn't moved forward at the moment. You know, what's interesting is how, even if it's certified before August or November, how the counties could feasibly implement it. And from, you know, my own perspective, you know, the state of Florida just received about a total of $40 million or so in HAVA election security funding, as well as CARES Act stimulus funding related to COVID voting. So there is money out there that states could be encouraged to, again, I have no idea what the technology needs are for a county that might have no idea what Democracy Live is to get it off the ground in a short period of time. But it would seem that like, hey, if the state has this money and we do have a little bit of time to have the discussion, and there are requirements in state law, and I'm an egghead here, section 101.662 is a provision that explains the state, how the state has an obligation to ensure that vote by mail balloting is accessible. And as a part of that requirement, the law actually says the state is supposed to confer with the disability community, as if that's a single thing here. But I would say perhaps a good thought for the state to have would be to reach out to groups like ours, other groups in the state, you know, with perspectives and with input about these issues, and try to engage the voters with disabilities in the state on what should change, how it should change, how vote by mail balloting can be made more accessible. So I hope that answers the question a little bit anyway.
It does. It does. Thank you. You know, at some level, this is like a perfect storm of issues coming up, and I know there's always challenges anyway. But what is it? Just give us some perspective. What is it that you are concerned with most right now as it relates to the upcoming election and voting accessibility? I mean, is it COVID? Is it, you know, what is it? What do you? I mean, there's so many things to look at, but just from a 30,000-foot perspective, what is it that you think is the most important issue that we should focus on?
I'm going to try to give a real brief answer, and then I'd be interested if Debbie or Jason had additional thoughts. But, you know, from my own perspective, it's the uncertainty of what August and November look like, and how it is that, like, if we're not spending the time now to prepare for the hopefully like non-existent possibility that in November, it's just not safe to go to City Hall or to put people in a long line, kind of like what we saw happen in Wisconsin a couple of weeks or a month ago, where, you know, because of some court actions that didn't go the right way there, voters were being asked to stand out in long lines at, you know, during a peak moment in the pandemic. And, you know, so the uncertainty, I think, is the big concern here, because if that is a reality, right, if you take in-person voting off the table at all, which again, we wouldn't advocate. We think there's a lot of reasons why voters with disabilities want in-person voting preserved, safe and accessible in-person voting. But if that's off the table, well, now I hope the state has spent time making sure that its vote by mail system's accessible, because there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of voters who that is not accessible for, just to receive a piece of paper and to be able to deliver that piece of paper with their expressions on it. So, hey, Debbie or Jason, do you guys have, like, you know, what is the thing that we're most concerned about?
For me, because it's signature mismatch for me, because I use a stamp to sign my signature because I can't write due to my muscle contraction. So, and when I do, it's a scribble, and the scribble changes depending on the day. So signature mismatch is a big issue for me, but like Tony said, it might be different for different individual. But that's my thought. What about you, Debbie?
Yeah, for me, it's this education and information. We got to make sure that we, as much as what's going on in the world, we keep these disability issues in the forefront of what candidates are doing. Voters need to be educated. They need to be registered. We need to make sure everyone votes. Yes, we need to work on how they're going to vote, but we need to make sure that they're actually prepared and ready to vote and that we don't miss timelines because there's other things going on. And that's what's so beautiful about this statewide coalition is there's enough people with different perspectives in different areas that we make sure that we're covering every area. And that's what's so fabulous. And there's a place for everyone to fit in for the part that's important to them. And then when you put all these pieces together, you get this really comprehensive approach towards voting in the state of Florida.
Thanks. We have a couple other questions. Hopefully we'll have time to fit them all in. One of them has to do with candidate platforms. I know you guys focus a lot on the process of voting, you know, registration, voting accessibility, things of that nature. Do you also track candidates' disability platforms and share that with people, or is that something that's kind of outside of what you're doing?
I can go ahead and take this one. With the original questionnaire that I talked about, we disseminated their answers. We got responses from the state governor, or the governor race, and each issue they responded to, we posted on social media and Facebook, so we do keep track of it. And we have our own website that's going to go live in a couple, I think, like, what, a week or two, Tony?
Yep, we should have our website live and ready for folks to come check out. It's actually live in a different format right now, but if folks wanted to go to accessthevote.org, and there's the website right there. That's where Disability Rights Florida at the moment has a voting access website, but that will be changing into our coalition's website in the next couple of weeks. And we're already thinking through cool ways to be able to use that resource as such. And, you know, to answer Jimmy's question just a little bit differently too, I do think there is a space to include candidate platforms. I mean, especially at the presidential level, right? Like, I think finding what one candidate or the other candidate, you know, their subpage about disability, you know, their disability platform, that's probably stuff that's real easy to link. Maybe we should talk about doing that for state legislative races, right? Like, if the candidate themselves or their campaign can forward to us their platform. Again, this is the responses to these questionnaires and things like that, like a platform. That'll be uneditorialized, and when we put it on our website, it'll just be the information itself. So these aren't gotcha moments. There really isn't a right or wrong answer to many of these questions, although maybe for some there are right and wrong answers. That's for you to decide. But it's important to make sure that equal opportunity for all of the candidates are afforded, and as well as that we stay true to something we didn't get a chance to talk about today, but we should have: nonpartisanship. Our group, we are strictly nonpartisan. We're able to have these discussions about how these issues break down the disability populations on a nonpartisan level, and the information we're trying to plug people into. We do a lot of discussion internally to make sure, like, hey, we fend off the partisan aspects of it, and that we just keep the issues central, keep the issues about increasing voting access central, and just keep the disability discussion central as well. Jeremy, you may have one or two more questions real quick while we're on this slide, though. The other part of this slide says Rooted in Rights video series, vote for access, and then there's 5 links. I think this is a slide that folks should be able to find through Family Cafe soon. If not, it'll be on Disability Rights Florida's website. You can look for it, but this page here has a link to 5 videos that have come out actually in the last month by the really awesome group out of Washington called Rooted in Rights. It's an audio-visual group made up of people with disabilities who put together these fantastic documentary quality video presentations. So each of these 5 videos is itself about 5 minutes long and talks about a different issue related to voting with a disability. Here's a personal plug for one of my disability heroes. The series itself is narrated by Imani Barbarin. Imani is the communications director for Disability Rights Pennsylvania, also the blog creator of the fantastic website Crutches and Spice. So if people like reading blog posts and sort of personal authorship, go look for Imani's stuff. Imani is such a powerful voice in this discussion. But all 5 of these videos were narrated by Imani, and I highly, highly recommend them. Just if you're interested, or to like give out to people, to send to people and be like, hey, this is something I'm thinking about, you know, as a person with a disability who wants to vote or wants to make sure that like my vote isn't suppressed or whatever. So I'll stop there if there's other questions.
And we do have a couple more, so
A couple more. How about
we can fit them in.
how about we do one more? And this is a little bit open-ended, but I thought it would be a good way to kind of end the question period here. And this person asks, what kinds of accommodations are there for people with disabilities? So before you answer that, let me just say, you know, I think it would maybe a good idea to just kind of give a quick overview of what kind of accommodations there are, just so that everybody kind of knows their rights moving into this cycle.
So I'll jump on that if Jason and Debbie wanted me to. So, you know, there's, of course, the accommodations that we try to have in place to be able to have these coalition calls. So if anyone listening or anyone receiving this information has a need that could be accommodated to help them participate, again, that's my email address is up there. All of ours are actually. My own is TonyD@disabilityrightsflorida.org. And I'll do my best to make sure that anything we can do to help you is accommodated. In terms of voting accommodations, that's sort of supposed to already be part of the voting systems itself. So like accessible equipment is an accommodation. You know, it's the ability to use a voting equipment, but in an accommodated way so that you're able to access that technology. You know, but the reasonable accommodation request process can have other relevance to the discussion, right? If there's a need of yours that you would like accommodated by your county supervisor or by a precinct that you're intending to go and vote at, it's fully reasonable for you to get in touch and ask these questions plain language. You know, hey, due to a disability, I have a need for an accommodation in this regard. And that's not a guarantee that like the person receiving that request can always accommodate you. And what it is a beginning of an interactive process where unless the supervisor or the county can show that there's a financial hardship or some undue burden to provide the accommodation, then it probably does have an obligation to find out, like, why is it that this ramp doesn't work for you? Or why is it that if all of our pulse, equipments are on the second floor and the elevator isn't big enough for your wheelchair to do a perfect pivot in, what can we do to help you? So even though the accommodations are already supposed to be built into the system, there is still room to ask for help and to ask for an accommodation so that, again, you as a voter with a disability can have an equal benefit from these systems, from the voting systems. So I appreciate the chance to talk so much, Joe and Jeremy and Jason and Debbie, my colleagues. We talked about our story today, and I hope we did a good job explaining, 2 years ago, we were all wandering in the desert. None of us knew, hey, how are we able to talk, or are we able to talk? We found each other and we've stayed together and we built some steam behind this thing, and we'd like to stay together into future voting election cycles too. So thanks to Family Cafe for giving us a chance to talk about this. And please, anyone listening or hearing this or receiving this information another way, please feel free to join up with us, and we'll help plug you in and talk about these things real time. So
really important stuff. Thank you very much, guys. Great job. Thank you so much.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's great that we were able to cover voting there. I know when we did the Governor's Summit back on Friday, we talked a little bit about how important it is for us here at the Family Cafe to help people out there in our community develop their advocacy voice. And, you know, it's important to get to know your legislator and know what's going on in Tallahassee and things like that. But the number one thing you can do to be heard, of course, is what?
To vote.
Vote.
Please
V-O-T-E.
do. Yeah.
So, yes, if you are not registered to vote, please get out there and make sure you're registered, and please exercise that right. It's so essential to making sure people with disabilities play a part in plotting the course for our country and our communities.
Well, and I want to say, I think Tony made an important point there in the end. I mean, we all know that there are certain accommodations that exist, but if you have a special request, if you have something, start that conversation, make the request, and you know, they will begin to help you figure out how to you know, deal with that issue. And so, don't think you can't ask, because you can.
Absolutely. All right, well, that's one more day of our virtual 22nd Annual Family Cafe in the books. Thanks again for joining us. I just want to let you know, before we sign off, what's coming up tomorrow. We have, coincidentally, 2 different 101 sessions available tomorrow. In the morning, we have Able United with Able 101, talking about Able accounts, a great way to save money outside of any kind of tax obligation. You probably heard about them since we've been reading their promos here. And again, they're great sponsors of us this year. And then the afternoon, we have Accessible Travel 101. So Lord knows we're all stuck in our houses quite a bit in the last few months. Right. So this is a good session if you want to start thinking about how you're going to get around once you have an opportunity to do that.
Absolutely. That'll be at 2 o'clock with Sylvia Longmire, Accessible Travel, How to Explore the World with a Disability. That will be nice when we can do that again, won't it?
Absolutely. All right. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. And we will see you at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Have a great day.
Thank you.
We're out.
We're out. Good job, guys. Jason, Debbie,
Thank you.
Tony, you were great. That was
Thanks
very
so
good
much.
conversation.
Appreciate
That was
it.
very substantive and really good.
Thanks for everyone's help. Sorry for any of the sign language interpreters if I was talking faster.
You were fine.